You're listening to The Voice of Russia from London with me, Tim Walklate. Last year's so-called Summer of Sport is meant to be remembered as one which united not only Britain, but brought the whole world together as the London 2012 Games captivated a global community. Part of that community spirit, engendered by what was dubbed the People's Games, was the staging of the biggest Paralympics in history. Nearly 3 million spectators watched live Paralympic events, which were also broadcast to over 115 countries worldwide. The likes of Ellie Simmonds, who has dwarfism, amputee Johnny Peacock and paraplegic David Weir are now all household names in Britain after they starred during the Games. But 1 year on, has that feel-good factor resulted in a change in attitudes towards disability and the disabled? Last week, a survey of over 1,000 disabled adults in the UK by the charity Scope found that 81% had experienced no improvement in the attitudes shown towards them. More shockingly, it found that nearly a fifth of those with disabilities had been subject to physical abuse or even attack since last year's Games. Campaigners say that disabled people are often stigmatised as benefit scroungers because of government budget cuts and increased political rhetoric on welfare standards. Joining me in the studio to discuss this is Sue Bott, Director of Policy and Development at Disability Rights UK, Lisa Egan, a disability rights activist, Roger Lewis, a member of the steering group Disabled People Against Cuts, Scott Moorhouse, the British record holder for Paralympic javelin, and on the phone is Craig Spence, Communications and Media Director at the International Paralympic Committee. I'd first like to ask each of you, did the Paralympics change attitudes towards disability or did they not? Lisa?
They changed attitudes towards Paralympians. For the first time, you've got people like Sarah Story and Ellie Simmonds and David Weir, who are all household names, and Paralympians have never really had that kind of celebration before. But for ordinary disabled people, things have gotten much worse. And the Paralympics kind of contributed to that in a way, because we repeatedly saw David Cameron and George Osborne going on the telly and giving this spiel that if some disabled people can be Paralympians, then there's absolutely no need for any disabled people to be claiming out-of-work sickness benefits, as if you can run like Johnny Peacock when you're hooked up to a chemo drip. So I think that the Paralympics were used as a stick to beat ordinary disabled people with.
See?
I agree with that. I mean, actually, the best bit of the Paralympics was when George Osborne got booed, wasn't it? But yeah, I mean, mixed feelings, really. I mean, watching it, as a disabled person, I felt very proud of what my fellow disabled people were achieving that I could never achieve in a million years, So, I mean, the feel-good factor was absolutely fantastic there. And I think it did bring together disability sport with disability rights movement in a way that's not happened before. So that was very good. But I agree with Lisa. It kind of was, if Paralympians can achieve this, then so can all disabled people. And actually there's been quite a lot of evidence of that since, where disabled people have experienced people saying, well, actually, we don't need to make adjustments for you because we've seen that you can do everything now, and that doesn't really help. That just further discriminates against disabled people.
Scott?
My experience of the Paralympics was perhaps a little bit different to you guys here. I was fortunate enough to be at the age and have the talent where I was able to compete in London, and what was a fantastic experience for me. Obviously, it's been a fantastic step forward for disability sport. Athletes that are disabled are now regarded as athletes and equal counterparts to Olympians. A lot of this kind of training schedules has been going on, the same as the Olympians, has been going on for years, but only now does that recognition kind of be received. The interesting thing is, as Lisa and Sue have touched upon, of how it affects people with disabilities in general. Obviously, those represented at the Paralympics, in many cases, only is a small fraction of the amount of disabilities that there are in total. So absolutely, there are many disabilities that are of such an impairment where they would not be able to perhaps go on and run, like Johnny Peacock or some of the other household names. But what I find interesting about the Paralympics is this word legacy, because we talk about legacy, and we've talked about it before the Games, and we talk about it now. But what does that mean? There's been no real definition or specification of if we achieve this, if we do this, then we've created the legacy. So it kind of feels like we're setting ourselves up for a fall with that, because how do we know that we've achieved it? It seems that all we can say is, well, this hasn't happened and this isn't happening now. There's no, well, this is what actually has happened and this is the legacy, because we don't know what the legacy is.
There's been one positive legacy that's come out of the Games, and that was before 2008 when Ken Livingstone was the Mayor of London. He had outlined great plans to improve access to a lot of the London Underground. And then when Boris Johnson came to office, he cancelled all those plans except for the access upgrades that were essential for delivering the Olympics and Paralympics. Now that the Games are over, Boris Johnson has set the budget for tube access upgrades to £0 for the next 3 years.
I'd like to raise that issue a bit later, but I'd just like to get briefly the words of Roger and Craig. Roger first. I mean, in your opinion, did they change people's attitudes towards disability?
I think I kind of agree with Lisa and Sue on this one, but I think what I'm sort of add to that is I think we need to look at two things here. One is the achievements and the position of the Paralympian athletes themselves, and then secondly, the Paralympic movement and the politics of it and how it's been used and was being used last year, particularly by the government, by Cameron and the government. I think we need to separate those two things out. I think when we look at the Paralympian movement since certainly Barcelona in 92 and even just before that, the Paralympics and Paralympians have actually played a very important role in presenting an aspect of disability achievement. This is tempered by the fact that cost is involved as well, and a lot of Paralympian action involves highly technical equipment, which is very, very expensive, and there's a class element in this as well as to who can have access to that when we look at the wider issues. But I think there are some very positives around the Paralympians themselves and their achievements, and this was very much recognised last year when DPAC, Disabled People Against Cuts, the organisation I'm on the National Committee of, was separating out our criticism of the sponsorship of the Games by Atos and the use of it by the government, separating it from any opposition which we didn't have to the Paralympians themselves and their achievements. And that was echoed by a lot of Paralympian athletes who we know weren't able to articulate that because of the clauses in their contracts and the non-politicised nature of involvement in the Games. I think sadly it is that the real legacy has not been there, but within it there are some very positives that have come out of around some of the individual achievements and showing what disabled people can be capable of.
Craig?
Well, first and foremost, I don't think a legacy should be judged after 12 months. A legacy is something that's judged over a period of years, if not decades. And 12 months on, we have to say, are we in a stronger position than we were this time last year? I'd like to think so. I think there's a greater awareness of the Paralympians. There's a great appreciation of people with an impairment. I wouldn't also judge things on just one survey by scope. There's been multiple surveys published since London, straight from the Games, and then there's been so much data about perceptions and attitudes, and effectively I think those surveys can be skewed to suit whatever need. Just 1 month before Scope survey, YouGov came out with a survey through Nationwide that said, yes, perceptions had changed and there was a greater acceptance, and that sort of like ties in with some really in-depth research that LOCOG did at the end of the Games last year, which said that 81% of people had changed their opinion of people with a disability. Now, the key is that the Paralympic Games has set a platform. The key is now to build on that platform so that those attitudes and perceptions continue to change, not just in 1 year, 2 years, but over a period of decades. Rome wasn't built in a day, and we won't expect attitudes to change overnight. And what we've got to continue to do is ensure that those attitudes continue to move in the right direction over a period of time.
I think that view flies in the face of people's reality on the ground. I think what you're alluding to there in people's perceptions of disability is probably towards people who are very visually, obviously disabled and are out in positions where they're visible and achieving. What we're seeing on the ground, and it's more than just a single survey by Scope, this has been done by quite a number of organisations over many years, and it's been a consistent pattern that as we've seen the rhetoric changing in society around benefit dependency at scroungers, very particularly geared towards perceptions of disability benefit fraud, that these attitudes have changed very remarkably. I'm surprised at what you're saying there, Craig, because I think there's no doubt that the situation's deteriorated nationally very substantially.
I think that for me, the Paralympics is unrelated to some of the issues that perhaps have been raised in some of these surveys. What these surveys are suggesting certainly when you read the Scope survey, which can't be taken in isolation, is that people, A, lack education because they think of someone that's disabled and they think someone in a wheelchair or someone with a leg missing, or they're the common, or someone that's old. They're the common stereotypes of people with disabilities, but also the fact that some people with disabilities are scrounging the system. Obviously, that's being addressed now with this new PIP system that the government has put in place. And we can't sit here and say that people with disabilities, aren't helping themselves in some instances, because they're not, because there are people that do fraud the system. And unfortunately, it's those minority that spoil it for the majority. As if you look at people with gay rights, if you look at racism, it's always the minority that spoils it for the majority. So Paralympics has been great for disability sport, but I think this is unrelated to attitudes in general.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. Didn't the Paralympics, coupled with what you said earlier, surely it did educate the general population about maybe disabilities that people didn't know about?
Perhaps, but I guess for most people on the street, they don't know what disability looks like day to day. They understand that, okay, this guy's got a leg missing, but they don't understand the issues that most people face that have disabilities on a day-to-day issue, and why perhaps the majority of those need some kind of support, which is why there's those benefit systems in place.
Lisa?
Several things that have been said in the last few minutes. Firstly, about the change to the personal independence payment. Disability living allowance at the moment has a fraud rate of 0.5%. Whenever you see research into perceptions of disability benefits, people always think that the fraud rates are higher than they actually are, but the fraud rate is 0.5%. But they're aiming to cut 20% of the budget, which means that 500,000 disabled people are going to lose money they really need. And that's going to affect Paralympians of the future. As Roger has already said, Paralympic sport costs a lot of money. When I was a teenager, I swam because I'm from a working class background. My family couldn't afford a racing chair, so I couldn't take to athletics or anything like that. And so young potential Paralympians of tomorrow who won't get personal independence payment or disability living allowance or whatever, and so they won't be able to afford to buy a racing wheelchair, so they won't even get to try out at wheelchair racing to see if they're any good at it. It's going to have.
That has changed, though. You've got the David Weir Academy now in London that's set up to address some of those issues. You've got UK Athletics, where there's a lot of talent days and lots of events that take place around the country to give people the opportunities that perhaps wouldn't otherwise into trying disability sports, because, no doubt there is a lot of equipment involved in certain sports and it is expensive. But equally, if you go into any other career, it's tough. It's not easy. We shouldn't be given everything on a plate equally. We should have to work for it. Sometimes we need a little bit of luck. So it can go too far the other way, I believe, as well. But I agree with what you're saying. The benefit system, it is going to cause an issue. There clearly are people that need that kind of support. We're in a growing population, so statistically that's probably only going to get worse.
Yes, because the government keep pointing out that the number of disability living allowance claimants has increased in the last 20 years. But what they're failing to mention is that medicine has improved a lot in the last 20 years. People with impairments who would have died by the age of 20 are now living to 30, 35. More premature babies are surviving but are being left with cerebral palsy. People are living longer. This is why the number of claimants is going up. It's not fraud, as the government keep claiming.
Yeah, and of course the numbers are not going up as much as the government claim anyway. They've gone up in 13%, isn't it, in the last 10 years, as opposed to, 33%, I think the government were claiming. But I just want to return to this about legacy and the point you made, Craig, about we need a good few years to change attitudes, and just after 12 months we're not going to change things. And I think this is a good point. We do need to be careful about what can be claimed in a legacy, really, because we need to bear in mind that we've had generations and generations of prejudice against disabled people, and it's not going to change overnight. Yes, the Paralympics was a good step towards changing attitudes, but actually we need to do a lot more than that, because I don't want us to stop at some idea of legacy. We need to go on and do a lot of things, and I think really importantly, not to think that because attitudes haven't changed, that therefore the Paralympics were some kind of failure.
Inclusion and access are the big issues that disabled people need. We need opportunities if we're going to be able to take part in all the ranges of every part of society, including at work. What we had was a situation before the financial recession that unemployment rates were running at over 50%, 56% on average for disabled people, up to 70, 80, even 90% for particular impairment groups. That situation is deteriorating rapidly because of the advantages we made in our movement from our own efforts and our right to work and getting the legal support to be able to do so in the 1980s and 1990s. A lot more disabled people have been in work, particularly in the public sector. With that being slashed back to the degree that it has, we're being planned out of work. Work's becoming more precarious. There's more part-time working. There's 0 hours contracts. These are all barriers to disabled people beginning to even be on the ladder.
But we are living in tough economic times still. I mean, I don't know if we're
at the top of society. We're seeing now that the gap's richer and growing, and we're seeing a report coming out this week. It was in yesterday's Observer highlighting that the gap between the professional classes, those at the top and those at the bottom, is growing and growing and growing. There's plenty of money here. We have to be absolutely clear that this is not about a financial crisis and a financial necessity. This is about an attempt by a government who wants to use it in an ideological way to push back every advance that disabled people and other groups have made over the last 30 years.
Craig cited this nationwide survey finding that 65% of Britons believe disabled people are better recognised as being able to lead normal lives and achieve at work. Craig, what can the IPC do to try and tackle issues like this, especially during, let's be honest, a difficult economic crisis?
I think what the IPC can do is we can try get more coverage for disability sport in the UK and worldwide, because that shows, we've seen it in previous Paralympic Games, that shows and helps to change attitudes and perceptions. And what we've seen previously is just the Paralympics and then no coverage until the next Paralympic cycle. And what we've seen, one of the great things to come out of London is more media coverage in between the games. So we've had some major world championships and regional championships this year. Some of them have been shown live on TV, live on radio and in newspapers, and that's helping the momentum. And we've also seen a greater investment in parasport this year. So Sport England have invested far more than ever before in grassroots sports to try and get more people engaged in the sport. And UK Sport has, I think, increased their funding in elite sport by 43% through to Rio. So the money is there, and the money is going back into the grassroots and the elite level. And the results are already being seen. We've seen 50,000 more people taking part in parasport as a result of the Games. But we realise there are barriers still to participation, as was mentioned there. We've started our GTOS Foundation to try provide low-cost equipment for people to get engaged in parasport. Parasport's no different to any other sport. You do need to invest money in equipment for certain areas of our sport, as you would do in able-bodied sport.
But the prices are often much higher for Paralympic sport. Racing wheelchair costs a lot more than a good pair of running shoes.
I appreciate that, and that's why through our GTOS Foundation we've launched a low-cost racing wheelchair that we're selling to National Paralympic Committees so that they can invest in it and put those chairs into clubs, so that you might not have your own chair until you really do specialise, but you may be able to go and practice wheelchair racing. But there are other parasports available where you don't need to invest in equipment.
But I was going to say, again, you've got things like a hand cycle costs more than nipping down Halfords and buying a bike.
But if you want to do elite cycling, you have to invest in an elite bike. In the same
but
way.
At the starting level, no one starts at an elite level. Everyone's got to start somewhere.
Obviously, being an amputee, the kind of specialist legs required to compete at the top level are very expensive. You're looking around about 9 or 10 grand as an above-knee amputee. When I first started sport, I didn't have access to that kind of equipment. We're fortunate in the UK that we do have the NHS and we do have some kind of support there. So using the legs that I had through the NHS, I was actually able to progress to a good enough level where then I caught the interest of some of the bigger prosthetic manufacturers who were then able to provide me with parts, with working with my governing body as well to support me in my further development. For me, it wasn't like I need this leg straight away. And I think there's often this perception around technology, that technology fixes a lot of problems. But actually, Paralympic sport's not about that. There obviously has been a lot of controversy around the blades, but you have to be a great athlete. And I think sometimes that gets lost, that message, when we're talking about the expensive equipment, because ultimately it comes down to the athlete, and you can progress quite far, I believe. I've done it myself without a lot of expensive equipment.
I think it comes down to opportunities again. But if you don't have the opportunities to even begin to do anything other than but try and survive with the basic necessities of life, but this is the reality for huge numbers, hundreds of thousands of disabled people. It's a matter of how am I going to get food on my table next week? I'm running the risk of being sanctioned. Now they're talking about taking away my DLA, and I've got the bedroom tax on top of that, and now I've got the community charge to pay on top of that. We've got disabled people who are queuing at food queues. They are not going to be able to take part in any sport. The reality is the dream of achieving sporting achievement, even in a recreational situation, depends on your ability to have a stable and solid life, and that's what's being taken away systematically.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Tim Walklate. 1 year on from London 2012, I'm asking, have attitudes towards disabled people changed for the better? Joining me in the studio to discuss this is Sue Bott, Director of Policy and Development at Disability Rights UK, Lisa Egan, a disability rights activist, Roger Lewis, a member of the steering group Disabled People Against Cuts, Scott Moorhouse, the British record holder for Paralympic javelin, and on the phone is Craig Spence, Communications and Media Director at the International Paralympic Committee. I'd quite like to ask you, Lisa, you mentioned about wheelchair-friendly tube stations earlier on. What's everyday life like for you getting around London?
It's incredibly difficult. I live not that far from King's Cross St Pancras. It's not my nearest station, it's like my second or third nearest station. And when that became fully accessible a few years ago, that really opened up London to me. Suddenly my world was so much bigger than it had been before they installed lifts there. You hear people moaning about how sweaty it is on the tube and how you ended up sitting there trying to read your book and someone had their crotch in your face. But at the end of the day, I still get excited when I get to go on the tube because it's such a rarity. There are so few accessible stations. I still get a little, I'm going on the tube kind of feeling inside, and that shouldn't be the case. I'd actually used the underground system in Los Angeles on holiday before I had ever used the tube in London.
But you'd say that it has improved.
Oh, it definitely has improved, but that doesn't mean there's not a long way to go.
The temporary ramps that were available during the Paralympics, and very welcome too, that Lisa would have been using as part of that network, we got them because they were being taken away. They were being withdrawn immediately after the Paralympics. It was only because of campaigning by disability groups, Transport for All, one of our disabled people's organisations, and other disabled groups, that we got them to put the temporary ramps back in the tube stations.
Would you say, as a blind person, are people more comfortable speaking about disability to you than maybe a year or two ago?
I'm very visibly impaired. I use a long white cane, so I represent a very comfortable image, if you like, something that people are very familiar with about sight loss. I tend to get patronised more than anything else by people, and it's a lack of awareness. So in many ways, I don't experience that kind of difficulty. However, my eye condition means my eyes look okay if you look at the front of me, and I have had an experience in my own area where I live of someone just coming up to me straight in my face saying, "You're a scrounger, you're a fraud." And when you get that right in your face, it kind of takes you aback, and it affects your confidence about going out the next time.
So you'd feel the same with your very well-behaved guide dog, which I must say has been very patiently just sitting and waiting. You'd feel the same?
Well, actually, funnily enough, I mean, one of the reasons why I have a guide dog is because I find attitudes towards me are much different with the guide dog than they ever were with the cane. You know, as well as guiding me around, she's a fantastic go-between and an icebreaker. But, you know, in an ideal world, really, it shouldn't be like that. I mean, fortunately, I absolutely love dogs.
Scott?
For my personal experiences, you know, my experience has been quite positive. As Roger mentioned, with being visually impaired, it's quite visual, so it's very obvious if I'm wearing a prosthetic leg, especially in the summer, that I have a leg. And with the success of the Games, that's become actually quite a cool thing to have. But what I think, some of the things that Roger's mentioned, is that this is really a problem to do with education. A lot of people, there's still that kind of uncomfortability where people don't know how to broach people with disabilities because they're not sure whether they're going to get upset. And that boils down to a lack of education down from schooling years. So certainly when I went to school, there was no education on disabilities. I mean, there's loads of disabilities.
Surely with such a successful Paralympic Games, the most successful ever, we should say, really. 3 million people going to watch events in the stadia every single day, broadcast to hundreds of countries worldwide. Surely the more that happens...
But the reality is people don't understand. They watch the games, they see athletes compete, but they represent a tiny minority of disabled people.
But they'll still be watching the events with other disabled people.
They will,
well.
but they don't know what it means on a day-to-day basis. They don't know what people with perhaps severe disabilities that aren't able to compete, at that kind of level on those kind of events. They don't understand what disability looks like day to day. They don't know the issues that they face and the support they require. And because of that ignorance, that's where a lot of this fire to the fuel comes from, because they don't understand.
Okay, we were really running out of time. So 30 seconds each, please, guys. How must attitudes in future be improved for the lives of disabled people, not just in Britain, worldwide? Lisa?
I think we need to end the hate.
Sue?
Well, I think it is partly what Craig said about the grassroots. We've really got to work in our communities so that people don't feel isolated and can get out of their own homes before we even start to think about what opportunities and what people can achieve.
Scott?
For me, I think it's going to take a long time for attitudes to change. Look at ethnicity, look at gay rights, for example. They've been battling those for years and years. It's still ongoing today. We've only moved a little bit. There's still a way to go. But, you're always going to get people that are going to be anti that. It involves activists for disability rights. It involves the government. It involves people within sport. It involves all these different people collectively coming together to achieve a common message, and that might involve feeding down from schools as well. Because at the moment there doesn't seem much unison in how we're actually going to go about tackling this. Everyone's trying to tackle their own little bit.
Roger?
I think we've got to create a discussion nationally in this country about the rhetoric of benefit dependency, why it's being used to push through cuts that are affecting huge numbers of people, and disabled people right at the heart of that. And then we can restart the conversation about the inclusion, the equality, the opportunities that we need in all spheres of life to get away from the segregation. And then we can actually sort of begin, and along the way continue to enjoy and celebrate the achievements of individual Paralympian achievement or in individual achievement in anybody's lives, but it has to start with a fair and equal society at the bottom.
And finally, Craig.
I think echoing what Scott said, really, I think education is absolute paramount to all of this, and that's one of the reasons why we target school children, because that's where they're the leaders of the future, and if we can get equality hammered home into them, then we're on to a starter. And I also think awareness. We're continuing the awareness in between the Paralympics and building on the platform of what was a great Games in London. I hope from this debate we're not thinking that the Paralympics last year were not a success. From our point of view, they were the best games ever, and it's important that we all work on the momentum and try not to judge a legacy after 12 months, but after a period of time.
Well, we'll have to end it there. I'd like to thank all my guests in the studio: Sue Bott, Director of Policy and Development at Disability Rights UK, Lisa Egan, a disability rights activist, Roger Lewis, a member of the steering group Disabled People Against Cuts, Scott Moorhouse, the British record holder for Paralympic javelin, and on the phone, Craig Spence, Communications and Media Director at the International Paralympic Committee. Thank you very much for joining me, Tim Walklate, on The Voice of Russia in London.